Hello, and welcome to our Thales Press 2021 to 2022 webinar series. This evening's webinar, Bioethics and Classical Education, is presented to you by Dr. Grattan Brown and hosted by Thales Press. I would like to thank everyone for attending and Dr. Brown for preparing this talk for us. My name is Winston Brady, and I'm the Dean of Academics at Thales Academy. I've been teaching at Thales for 11 years now, and for the past four or five years, I've helped create curriculum for use in our private school program. These educational resources have included textbooks, seminar readings, and videos that supplement the unique brand of classical education that we offer here at Thales Academy, from our K-12 program to our newest venture, Thales College. Thales Press is a natural extension of our efforts. The goal of such an in-house publishing firm is simple: to enlighten minds and empower students through the contemplation of what is good, what is beautiful, and what is true. Through Thales Press, we can lower curriculum purchases at Thales Academy by making our own readers and textbooks. We can make it easier for teachers to focus on the values and virtues of a classical education. And we can contribute, in however small a part, to the classical renewal movement by making the curriculum we use in our classrooms available online and in print for like-minded enthusiasts of classical education. With that, it is a unique privilege to have here Dr. Grattan Brown, for he is such a like-minded enthusiast of classical education. Dr. Brown is originally from Tennessee. He studied at Washington and Lee University, the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas, and the Lateran University in Rome, Italy. Dr. Brown has written and taught about bioethics, the liberal arts, and the moral culture of democracy and capitalism. He's also collaborated with professionals of religious and secular backgrounds in healthcare and business, and served on the ethics committee at Atrium Health for 10 years. He's also served as an associate professor of theology at Belmont Abbey College. He currently serves as the academic dean of Thales College and is responsible for the scope and sequence of its degree programs, recruiting faculty, and course design. Now it is time for me to turn it over to Alexandra Stroud, our development coordinator, for details concerning tonight's webinar, and then to Dr. Brown, our special guest this evening.
Hello, everyone. Again, thank you for joining. As questions arise during the webinar, I would just like to remind everyone to please just write down and save any of them that you might have until we get closer to the end of our presentation, which will be marked by a conclusion slide, which will signal you to go ahead and send your questions into our chat box. And then we will begin to answer them after the webinar. So we do this just in case our speaker ends up answering your question along the way. We will have a brief Q&A at the end of the webinar, and although we may not get to all of the questions because Mr. Brown will need to be brief about the questions so we can answer as many as we can, if you add your name and your email address at the end of your submission, we will be sure to follow up with an answer email so that no questions are missed. And this question's already arisen in the chat box. Yes, all of our webinars will be placed on our Thales Press page and on YouTube. So if you would like to revisit our conversation tonight, or if you'd like to share it with your friends, we will let you know when the video is posted via email sent to you. And please feel free to contact Winston as well with any other questions that may arise after this webinar is complete. His email address will also be posted at the end of this presentation. So with no further ado, Dr. Grattan Brown, welcome.
Thank you, Alexandra. Thank you, Winston. People began to think about bioethics in the middle of the 20th century. At the time, there were plenty of situations that led people to think about technology and biology in new ways. But I'll just mention two. In 1946, judges in Nuremberg, Germany, tried Nazi doctors for conducting horrifically cruel medical experiments on their captives, most of whom were Jewish. The judges needed laws by which to judge the actions of the Nazi doctors, but it was not clear what national or international laws they should use. In fact, Nazi doctors claimed that their actions conformed to law and to current research practices. But the gruesome and shocking nature of the Nazi medical experiments begged for genuine standards of accountability. So the judges turned from laws to the foundation of laws, moral standards. They produced a set of moral standards called the Nuremberg Code. You'd recognize these standards even if you had never read the Nuremberg Code. You would have recognized them if you had lived in the 1940s and had received a classical education. They're based on ideas such as all human beings have equal dignity, are free to do what is authentically good, choose based on what they know, have rights and responsibilities to care for their health. So before any researcher experiments on a patient, the researcher has to explain to the patient the experiment's benefit to society, and the risks and the procedures. Patient has to be free to participate or not, and to leave the experiment at any time. And the researcher has to gain all the knowledge they can from sources other than human experimentation. They have to minimize the suffering and the risk to the patient, and they have to update the patient on the developments increasing the risk as the experiment goes on. Well, the Nazi doctors did none of these things, but these foundational ideas were widely known and can serve as credible moral standards. And thus, the Nuremberg Code has become a seminal source for bioethics. My second example is organ transplantation. In 1954, doctors performed the first successful human kidney transplant. During the next few decades, the technology developed. More patients had hope of extending their lives, but the increasing practice of organ transplantation raised some serious ethical questions. Under what circumstances can doctors take organs from donors and transplant them into patients? If you transplant a kidney, the donor continues to live with just one. But if you transplant a vital organ like the heart, the donor would die. Does the transplant team have to wait until the donor dies? Or is the very end of the dying process good enough? Well, no, it's not ethical to cause death in order to harvest organs. But yes, we should think deeply about potential ethical ways of transplanting vital organs. When people began to think about these ethical issues about 70 years ago, they did not invent new morality. They drew upon moral theories that humanity has been developing for thousands of years. After all, it did not take our ancient ancestors very long to figure out the characteristics of human success and failure, and they're expressed in the wisdom literature of the ancient Near East and in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Human thinking changes in response to technological advances and has done so across ancient, medieval, and modern eras. But the fundamental dynamics of human life don't change. For example, organ transplantation raised a fundamental human question in a way that you might not expect. It raised the question, what is death and how do we know it has occurred? For a very practical reason. Doctors cannot wait very long after a patient has died to transplant organs because the organs begin to lose their functionality. And yet, for a dying person to bequeath an organ to another person, it can be a great act of charity. The traditional way of determining death is to test for breathing and a heartbeat and wait until caretakers are sure that both had ceased. But you cannot use that method and successfully transplant organs. Mechanical ventilators seem to provide a way around this problem because if a patient dies while on a ventilator, the patient's organs continue to receive oxygen and to function long enough to be transplanted. But how do you tell whether a patient has died on a ventilator? Since the late 1960s, some people have argued that if a patient's brain had ceased to function, then the patient had died. To be precise, they mean the irreversible and total loss of brain function, including the brain stem. Some people call this brain death. This standard seems to be a reasonably good sign of death because the brain integrates the other bodily systems to such a high degree. Doctors follow protocols designed to detect with high certainty whether the entire brain has lost functionality. Some people, doctors and philosophers included, have questioned if the existing protocols reliably tell us whether the brain has lost its functionality, and even if irreversible loss of brain function means that the patient has died. The debate and the evidence on both sides has advanced our thinking, not only about sound protocols for determining when death has occurred, but also what death actually is and is not. So whether you're a researcher or doctor or nurse, a citizen or a family member of a patient, or just a student trying to understand these issues, you need to know how to think in order to think fruitfully about these important questions. Teach me how to think is one of the most important goals of a classical education. In the same year that Nazi doctors were convicted, Dorothy Sayers delivered a famous lecture entitled The Lost Tools of Learning, in which she asked, have you ever, in listening to a debate among adult and presumably responsible people, been fretted by the extraordinary inability of the average debater to speak to the question or to meet and refute arguments of the speakers on the other side? Sayers meant that in order to think about important issues that people will face in their lifetime, they must first learn to observe, to read, to think logically, speak and write clearly to different audiences, understand as many subjects as they can, and relate those subjects to each other. Well, bioethics is a perfect example. Assuming you can observe and read and think logically, you should use philosophy to deeply understand ethics and human beings themselves, as well as politics and economics, if you can. You also need math and science to understand the human body and the diseases that afflict it and the treatments that could heal it. You must also be able to speak and write clearly to different audiences, master the art of conversation, because you'll need to rely on the expertise of others, to listen to the views of others, and to integrate all you know into the best responses that you can give. You need to recognize your mistakes and your limitations, those of others, and continue to hope for better outcomes and good luck despite the serious obstacles that you might confront. So let's try the classical method with bioethics. We'll start by defining our terms. Bioethics is about the morality of people's actions. The morality of people's actions regarding living things. Moral acts are those involving deliberation, choice, and implementation. If a person is deliberating, they're considering their options about what goals to pursue and what actions will accomplish the goals they choose. Once they try to implement their plan, they may or may not have a successful outcome. Next, you need a basic method for evaluating the different kinds of moral actions in the cases that come up. People recognize immediately that for an act to be morally good, the individual or the group involved must be acting with good intentions and for a goal that will actually benefit people. But as soon as you mention good intentions, people immediately remember that good intentions are not enough. You also need good outcomes. In other words, you need circumstances that provide a reasonable chance of success without causing even larger problems. Well, at this point, somebody will object and ask, well, what if a reasonable chance of success depends on lying and killing and stealing or some other kind of action long recognized as immoral? In other words, can you do evil to bring about good? Well, this last objection explains some very difficult and controversial bioethics issues. For example, if a patient experiences what they would consider to be unbearable suffering, should we end their suffering by ending their lives? Well, that would be an act of killing called euthanasia. To give another example, stem cells have great potential to heal the body, but should we destroy embryos in order to use stem cells in therapy? Well, that would be an act of killing that people often do not recognize as killing because the human beings are so small. Well, I would argue that we should not practice euthanasia or embryo destructive research because both those practices fail to respect the inherent worth of individual human beings. But that same inherent worth moves me to work hard to alleviate suffering. So I need to distinguish euthanasia from allowing a patient to die a natural death. I'd have to clarify that it's wrong to act or withhold treatment so that the suffering patient dies. But it's not wrong to withhold treatments that have become so burdensome and ineffective for the dying patient. I need to say that I'm against destroying embryos, but not against using stem cells derived in ethical ways. Holding the line against killing prevents scientists and medical professionals from settling on expedient options that cheapen human life and forces them to provide society with therapies in ways that do not involve killing. So our method for approaching bioethics issues first asks whether the kinds of actions involved can ever be good. Next, we'd ask if the people involved proceed with a good intention. And a good rule of thumb is to assume that they do and pay close attention to the circumstances, like conflict of interest, that would compromise their intentions. And finally, we'd ask if there's a hope of success without causing greater problems. Well, this method is a sound and clear one, and using it gives us two different kinds of clarity. First, it helps us distinguish different kinds of moral actions. Here's an example that might appeal to some of the people in sports. Using steroids to increase muscle mass in an AIDS patient or to reduce inflammation in an arthritis patient are the kind of acts we would call therapy. They restore lost or compromised functionality to the patient's body. But if an athlete uses steroids to increase muscle mass and then tries to call it therapy, what do you say? Oh, the crowd screams out, "Nope, pal, you're doping." And doping is not therapy. Well, the method also brings us a second, I would say, more difficult kind of clarity. It's clarity about what we do not know, what is ambiguous, and what is uncertain. For example, if we could correct the genetic causes of muscular dystrophy, we would do it. Naturally, we would treat the patients with the best genetic profile we know. Now, if that genetic profile were based on a naturally occurring mutation possessed by a very small but fortunate population, including a world-class athlete like Usain Bolt, we seem to have crossed a line somewhere between therapy and enhancement. But what we've really and clearly seen is that the concept of enhancement is not quite enough to work out the soundest moral thinking possible for this new technology. Now, recognizing ambiguity does not open the door to ethical relativism. We still recognize there's some kind of actions that ought never be done, and it's possible to define them so that moral standards and laws can prohibit them. We also recognize, though, that scientific discoveries and new technologies and difficult moral questions force us to improve our current thinking. The new technology CRISPR is a good example, and it's received quite a bit of attention in the past few years. CRISPR is a technique of gene editing, and gene editing itself does not seem to be an immoral kind of action. Briefly, gene editing means replacing part of one gene with genetic material introduced by researchers. It doesn't seem to be an immoral kind of action. We human beings have been taking action to influence the genetic profiles of plants and animals long before we understood genetic profiles. When the Augustinian monk Gregor Mendel described patterns of genetic mutations in the mid-19th century, he deepened our knowledge about breeding, which humanity has practiced on plants and animals for thousands of years. By the mid-20th century, scientists could deliberately increase the rate of genetic mutation through radiation. I should clarify, they were not experimenting on human beings. Then scientists discovered techniques to replace a DNA sequence in a gene, first at random sites on the genome, and then with precision, but inefficiently. CRISPR is the first highly precise and efficient means to edit multiple genes simultaneously in just about any cell and organism. CRISPR works by cutting a strand of DNA and supplying a complementary DNA that the cell's natural repair systems incorporate into a genome. It's easy to imagine how gene editing research could proceed ethically. Researchers edit the genomes of a bacteria or virus, observe what happens, and gain knowledge. They use that knowledge to edit the genome of higher animals, such as insects, observe what happens, gain knowledge, use that knowledge to experiment with more and more complex animals. So some uses of CRISPR would be a highly effective form of breeding. For example, CRISPR promises to improve crop yields, drought tolerance, and nutritional properties in plants. Its efficient, simple approach to gene editing in livestock may provide cheaper lean meat and alternatives to heat processed milk. Other potential uses of CRISPR represent medical therapy. Gene editing may help cure diseases and may help regenerate tissues using adult or induced pluripotent stem cells. Diseases like Huntington's disease or muscular dystrophy are caused by genetic mutations that CRISPR may eventually correct in humans. CRISPR may help AIDS patients to become more resistant to HIV. I even read recently in popular media that CRISPR may alleviate chronic pain by reducing inflammation. To say that CRISPR can be used for good does not mean that it's good however it's used. All these uses of CRISPR may have side effects and serious ones that we need to consider. Historically speaking, gene editing is still in its infancy. All medical treatments are currently hypothetical, and the first medical treatments may bring about such side effects that no one would choose them. Long-term side effects, in fact, raise some of the most important ethical questions. Scientists are currently researching the long-term effects of genetically modified foods. In a different example, if you correct the genome in a muscular dystrophy patient, any burdensome side effects end when the person dies. But if you correct the genomes in the reproductive cells of that patient with muscular dystrophy, then none of that person's descendants will inherit the genetic defect, but they would inherit the side effects as well. Modifying genes in reproductive cells is called germline editing, and it's one of the most controversial forms of gene editing. One strong argument in favor of limited germline editing is that what's good for one individual could be good for many. If we use gene editing to eliminate an individual's genetic disease, we would use it for others. In germline gene editing, a simple genetic modification would extend the benefit to the individual's descendants. On the other hand, germline genetic therapy would also carry burdensome side effects to many more people over a long period of time and would not be readily reversible. At an ethical minimum, developing germline editing technology deserves the highest level of scrutiny for safety and effectiveness. It also raises some profound questions about human nature. But leaving those aside for a moment, researchers might study the effects of gene therapy only on an individual to forecast the potential effects of germline therapy would have on the descendants, with as much certainty as possible. The method implies that gene editing would make it through animal experimentation and be found safe and effective enough to try in patients. On the one hand, germline therapy affects all future descendants and involves a high degree of uncertainty. On the other hand, scientists have long studied how genetic traits spread in rapidly breeding animal populations. And in fact, there's a gene editing technology for that too. It's called the gene drive. And a gene drive accelerates the spread of genetic traits in successive breeding generations. In the future, spreading genes for sterility in a species of mosquitoes might dramatically reduce malaria transmission in places where public health is poor and treatment is difficult. Gene drives might also remove invasive species in native ecosystems. But using CRISPR for gene drives in germline therapy carry high degrees of practical and moral uncertainty. If we eliminate a species of plant or animal from an ecosystem, what will be the impact on the organisms related to it? What organism will inhabit the niche it occupied? What effect will the new inhabitant have? And how will those outcomes affect the conditions that sustain human life? Like organ transplantation, these practices lead us to fundamental human questions and back again to practice. as we attempt to find our way through the ambiguities at the edge of our moral understanding. But again, the ambiguities do not force anyone into moral relativism. It's unpleasant to imagine, but we can predict some uses of CRISPR that are unambiguously evil, or at least highly questionable. Using gene drives to sterilize human populations is a new kind of eugenics to be condemned. Offering gene editing to parents to produce and update desirable qualities of intelligence or physique in their children would so undermine parental and peer relationships, it's difficult to imagine a morally good argument for any of it. But more pressing in our own day, CRISPR makes it easier to enhance lethal bacteria and viruses into a bioweapon that inflicts widespread suffering and death. The COVID-19 pandemic makes it easy to imagine and fear how a bioweapon would spread an unfamiliar disease quickly through a population, overwhelm healthcare professionals, and demoralize people. It's not surprising, though, that media reports sometimes confuse bioethical thinking. For example, what do you think of when you hear the term gain of function research? If you've been following the story about the origins of the COVID pandemic, you probably associate gain of function research with irresponsible science and even bioweaponry. You've likely read stories about the National Institute of Health in the United States funding experiments to enhance the lethality of a coronavirus at the Wuhan Institute of Virology in China. Well, if gain of function research means only enhancing pathogens for bioweapons or even for curiosity, well, then it's evil. But this is not the basic meaning of gain and function research. Gain and loss of function is a scientific term that researchers use to describe the changes they see in bacteria, an insect, or an animal that they experiment upon. They edit a gene and observe how the non-human organism changes. Thus, gain of function research could mean enhancing pathogens in a virus to the degree needed to test how the virus evades the human immune system. And scientists could use that knowledge to produce better vaccines more quickly. It's important to know, as the classical education teaches, how to use language and numeracy and logic. But it's even more important, as the classical tradition teaches, to know thyself. Self-knowledge in bioethics means thinking deeply, not only about the clear and present dangers, but also about the dangers hidden in our own desires. CRISPR enters a global social environment already shaped by advanced technology, raising moral controversies. We regularly see boundary-pushing cases raising ethical issues that are difficult to disentangle. For example, the Chinese scientist He Jiankui ended up in a Chinese prison in 2018 when he used germline editing, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, and in vitro fertilization to provide genetic HIV resistance in 2 babies. You might have seen the headline, went something like Chinese scientist gene edits human babies. Well, worldwide, scientists objected to the scientific knowledge about germline editing is not developed enough to attempt in humans. But notice that no one objected to pre-implantation genetic diagnosis or to in vitro fertilization, both of which raise serious ethical concerns. Pre-implantation genetic diagnosis can be good. It can help parents prepare to care for a child with genetic disabilities. But the problem is that it's often used in a decision to abort them. In vitro fertilization is also widely accepted, but raises the most serious ethical objections because it brings embryonic human beings into existence in a laboratory environment where they must be implanted in a mother to survive, where they can be manipulated before implantation or simply discarded or used merely for experimentation. Well, the moral repugnance that people felt when reading headlines like Chinese scientists gene edits human babies is provoked more by the idea of creating and manipulating human embryos than by providing HIV resistance. My guess is that He Jiankui knew that he was pushing the boundaries and he desired a first-class reputation. But he also surely held that he was following widely accepted social and research standards. In conclusion, I know I've raised many more questions than I've answered, but I hope that I've given you a purpose for thinking deeply within the classical liberal arts tradition. And if you're a student, I hope I've shown you that your education is not about completing assignments, but about preparing to think and act well about the most important things in life. Technological innovations let us do amazing new things. Amazing new things plus moral uncertainty equals shocking new things. And shocking new things plus danger equals fearful new things. But it will not do simply to ban what we fear, nor to resign ourselves to the evil that some will make of science and technological advancement. The human imagination needs to be both stimulated and tethered to reality. The classical liberal arts tradition teaches us how to think, how to devise methods of scientific experimentation and moral evaluation. But most importantly, to cultivate the wisdom and the virtue most likely to bring about human activities to a good end. So I'll stop there now and we can take some questions. But as you're thinking of your questions, remember this: biotechnology can provide really great benefits and can solve some important human problems that we've struggled with for a long time. But they're always going to raise some ethical and some deeply human questions and likely do it in practical ways. And we can draw from the classical tradition to think deeply about them. So I'll end it with that.
Dr. Brown, thank you. That was a fascinating talk. You gave us a wonderful overview of bioethics, its origins, and ways of bringing the sort of education we offer at Thales Academy into the realm of practical emerging concerns. So thank you so much for this talk and for all the time that you put into preparing this lecture for us. If you have any questions, you can go ahead and type them into the chat box now.
We're gathering a few, and I am just going to let them to accumulate a little bit. But while we do, I have one question already that's come in, and it is, does biotech end the possibility of laissez-faire economics?
No, they're two very different questions. What's the value and the possibility of laissez-faire economics, and what's biotechnology? The kind of economic system that a society adopts it doesn't depend upon any, technological advancement. So I'm going to leave it at that. And maybe the person asking the question might follow up with a more specific question.
Okay, our next question is, would people have to give permission to have their organs taken and donated after death when they first started doing transplants? Or did that right come when they started to question its ethics?
I'm not sure of the history of it. I wonder if the questioner might have in mind a specific event or from history. But remember, organ donation started about the same time as the Nuremberg Code was adopted. And the Nuremberg Code was mainly about research ethics, but in research ethics, a person must give their consent to be a research subject. Similarly, a person would have to give their consent in order to donate their organs after death. That's a basic respect for the human person, and not to do so would be immoral.
Thank you. All right, we have, how do you suggest students interested in bioethics get into the field? What are good foundational courses?
Good foundational courses, philosophy courses, not only ethics, but a good course on who are we as human beings. A branch of philosophy is epistemology, which studies how we know knowledge and how we think. Helpful would be psychology, which in a way is a branch of philosophy. My background is theology, and I would also encourage people to, those who are believers, to become familiar with the way in which their theological tradition affects their, can contribute to bioethical thinking. Obviously, you also need science if you're going to understand, if you're going to get into bioethics. So that's absolutely a requirement. And if you're also thinking about the medical profession, then go into the medical profession, but get a good liberal arts education along the way, and continue to read deeply into the Western tradition, not only philosophy, but also literature, because literature sensitizes us to our humanity in ways that philosophical arguments don't always do.
All right, I have a really interesting question. Is there some sort of international society that decides bioethics?
No. You might ask, well, decides what about bioethics? Like science has a kind of international community, so too bioethics has international organizations, and bioethicists across the world are in conversation with each other. It's no surprise, not only because scientists across the world are in conversation with each other and doing similar things, but also there are certain common features of humanity that that we all share, and that maybe lie at the foundations of human culture, be a good way of putting it. So bioethicists across the world are in conversation with each other, and there are organizations to promote that conversation, but there's not an authority, which seems to be what the questioner was asking about.
So I have a follow-up question to the laissez-faire economics question. And the follow-up is whether the market will make biotechnology so cheap that it will end up in dangerous hands.
Okay. CRISPR, some say, is a good example, because CRISPR lowers the bar for using gene editing technology. You need less education in molecular biology. And you don't need an expensive, the lab doesn't have to be expensive. In other words, it lowers the cost of doing gene editing. And that could make it easier for bad actors to use gene editing in order to create bioweaponry, for example. But again, the economic system that a society uses is not determined by the technology at its disposal. So I don't see a cause-effect relation between the two.
All right. Similar to the one that asked, is there an international society that decides bioethics? There's a question that says, you mentioned right and wrong in the presentation. What moral code is this based on?
Well, I was taking an approach based on a method that I explained. You want to ask, is a particular kind of action ever right or wrong? In other words, is it capable of sustaining human love, human trust, respecting the dignity of the human person? And this is more of an intuition than something I could prove, but I think everybody can come up with something they think is inherently evil. We might disagree about what it is, but infanticide, torturing babies, you can imagine all the things horrendous things that people do that ought to be outlawed and ought to be recognized as immoral. Well, those are kinds of actions that people would say, this is wrong, it should never be done. But most of the actions that people perform don't fall into that category. They might be morally questionable. And that's where you get into the circumstances in which people act, the likely effects? Are they going to solve a problem? Are they going to introduce bigger problems? And then what are people's intentions as they go about it? And what are their priorities? And I often, when I'm teaching people about morality, I say, yeah, there's wrong, and there are things that should never be done. But as soon as you're into the good zone, right? In other words, you're not talking about evil, you're not talking about wrong, you're talking about good, you're talking about right. There's not only good, but there's better and best. And most of us are doing good. We could probably do better in order to reach our best potential. And that's where we ask ourselves tough questions like, why not doping? Well, because it does something to competition, and it does something to human character that we largely suspect keeps us from really getting better. It might help us to win a competition, but there's something about the human character that says, oh, that's not really better. So I'll stop with that answer there. It's a big question, but I'll stop there.
I think we have time for one more question. And it says, it would seem to me that a prevailing postmodern relativistic worldview and serious inquiry into bioethics are incompatible. Would you agree? If not, why?
I'd like to know a little bit more what the questioner would mean by postmodern. It might mean relativism. It might mean the idea that you really things have no form or nature, and we really can't define them. So how can we really have a meaningful conversation at all? And I would oppose that view. I think postmodern thought has some contributions, but I don't think that's one of them. The idea that I just named is really one of them. And what I've noticed as a practical matter is that people at some point come upon problems, or they get beat up, or they come into a situation where they realize that either they or somebody else is, if they haven't committed some outright evil, they're doing something wrong, and they're trying to. The point is they start to pivot, and they start looking for what's a moral ground. It's not just because I say so that something is right or wrong. It's because there's something outside of my mind and everybody else's mind that makes it so. And I don't think that intuition is ever going to go away, even with the kind of pressure of postmodernist thought.
Thank you for that one. We do have another one that just came in. Most ethical standards cannot have a legal basis. Do you believe that laws will eventually be placed on bioethical issues?
Can you read that question again?
Sure. Most ethical standards cannot have a legal basis. Do you believe that laws will eventually be placed on bioethical issues?
Well, laws are already involved in bioethical issues. And it's not that ethics can't have a legal basis, it's that laws have an ethical basis. In other words, when the laws have a foundation in morality, that's why the judges at Nuremberg turned to a set of a moral code and not to a system of international law. I'll just leave the question at that.
As a response to the previous question, the questioner said, perhaps it would have been better to say the prominence of moral relativism is incompatible with inquiry into bioethics. And thank you for your response.
Well, I think, again, you'd have to say, well, which aspects of postmodernism, systems of philosophical thought might be found wanting, and on the whole, they typically have some kind of contribution they can make. If something sounds plausible, there's usually some truth. It's usually the partial truth that kills it. So I don't think that the prevalence of relativism makes bioethics conversation impossible. I think it makes it more important. And it's at basis human beings reasoning with each other and trying to persuade each other. And the difficult experiences that I referred to before, I think maybe make people wake up and think, and they look for moral foundations, which are not so well supplied by postmodern thought, but are supplied in a much more sound and persuasive way in the classical tradition.
So the next two questions are actually kind of similar, just two different sides of the coin. One says, if you do something that is considered unethical by bioethics, is it up to the country you're in to bring charges against you? And the next says, do you think that religion should be considered when talking about bioethics and laws on it? So if you want to kind of just speak to both of those.
I think the general answer is yes, you can have laws about bioethics. You can have and enforce laws about actions that bioethics also evaluates. So there are all kinds of laws governing, for example, organ transplantation, and they're enforced. The other one is, should we consider religion? Well, of course we should. We should consider every source of human knowledge that we can. And considering religion doesn't bias anyone inappropriately, and it doesn't discriminate against those who are not religious. If that were true, then somebody who took a non-religious view would be discriminating against those who are religious. And you end up spinning in circles that way. And religion teaches important truths about the human person and about ethics. And in fact, it is the way that many, if not most people, learn moral character. Religions are a repository of wisdom gathered through the ages about the goals and the means of a good life. So we'd be foolish if we didn't look to religions in order to evaluate what we're doing. And also, when you get down to caring for patients, patients often have a religious background, and you care for them better by understanding that background. So yes, religion and bioethics go well together.
Okay, that looks like the last of our questions. Thank you all who participated in the Q&A. You really posited some really great questions. And again, if you have any more that you would like that kind of hit you while you're sleeping tonight at 2 a.m. and you just wake up and you have to ask Dr. Brown, please write that down and feel free to go ahead and email us. You can see at the bottom of the screen right now, Winston's email address. That's the perfect way to go. And we will make sure that all those questions make it back to Dr. Brown. And we will also get that back to you. And again, our webinars are all recorded and they will be placed on our webpage, and you will all be notified and emailed through your registration email with that content once it is uploaded. So with that, I'm going to let Mr. Brown go, and just thank you again for just speaking. And I know it's a heavy topic, and it's got a lot of content to it and a lot of thoughts swirling around it. So obviously it can't be completely condensed into, a 45-minute conversation, but I like that we are here gathered to be able to discuss something as big as bioethics, and to continue this conversation if it's something that interests you. So I'm going to turn this over to Winston to close us out, and we look forward to you attending the next webinar that we have on engineering.
Dr. Brown, thank you so much again. Really appreciate your time. This might be the close of the webinar, but it's the start, the continuation of the great conversation about ideas that matter. Our next upcoming webinar, and I want to encourage you to join us, is Engineering as a Career Field. We have as our special guest Bill Griffin, who is the Vice President of Manufacturing at Captive Air Systems. He's speaking on engineering and the ways that classical education in general and Thales Academy in particular can help prepare students for this career field. So I want to thank everyone who's participated in this webinar, everyone who's attended, for the wonderful questions, really good, engaging, thought-provoking questions from the audience members, and just really enjoyed this time together. Dr. Brown, thank you so much again. Alexandra, thank you so much. And everyone have a wonderful evening. Thank you guys so much.